Hello. I thought I would take a few moments and talk about the assignment that you had for the table, and generally for the rest of my students who are going to watch this. Just this business about definitions, just in general, because it's sort of a strange thing that you may not have sort of considered or thought about. So it bears some time to try to work our way through this. So so these are some typical remarks that I would make during the course of a semester and from semester to semester. One thing that I would want you to notice in thinking of our definitions, in this case I asked you to consider a table. Of course, I mean a thing, not a mathematical table, not a panel of people, not a sort of metaphorical place to share ideas and so on. Although those are important, I was actually thinking about the thing in your room that you sit at and so on. One thing I wanted you to notice in your definition and when you compared it to the dictionary definition, it's just exactly how broad both of those definitions were. One thing you should have seen in both of your definitions, your definition and the dictionary's definition, is both of those definitions allowed a huge amount of objects to be counted as tables. Oftentimes students will remark how broad the dictionary definition is. Look at your definition again and see exactly how broad it is. And a lot of you notice, and a lot of you will notice, that your definition admits of things as tables that you wouldn't normally call a table. That someone would point to something and it would fit your definition, and so you could call it a table, and yet no person in their right mind would call it a table. The same happens for the dictionary definition. So you should have noticed that similarity. So some of you weren't even as specific as you thought you were being. You still ended up with a definition that allowed far more as a table than what any of us would be actually willing to call a table. So I hope you noticed that. The other thing, and you, unless you were in a study group, you might not have noticed this, so I'll just tell you. One thing that we can notice is the sheer amount of definitions there are of what a table are. You go to Merriam-Webster's, you get one definition. You go to the freedictionary.com, you get another definition, and so on and so on. And you as students come up with a wider range of definitions. I wish I could share them with you. Maybe in a future semester I can do things like that. But the sheer number of definitions. And so the question arises, like, what are we actually talking about? If what you mean by a table is one thing, when I ask you to be specific about it, is different from what someone else means, then again, this invites the question about what it is we actually mean when we're talking about tables. If you think a table is a matter of something having 4 legs and a flat surface, what about when someone else thinks it's 2 legs or 3 legs and let's say a not so flat surface and so on? What about tables that don't have legs? There are certainly those tables and so on. So do they get counted as tables? And again, my point is what are we talking about when you and I are talking about tables, when we're using this word, when clearly we think of tables as lots of different things. And not just lots of different things, but even our definitions allow things we wouldn't normally call as tables. So another thing you should have noticed, I think, is or maybe that you couldn't have noticed. This is more something that I would notice that I'm telling you. But one thing we can notice is one of the problems with our definitions, and that sometimes, even as clear as we're trying to be, it becomes unclear what we're actually talking about, and that certainly came across in your exercises. Another aspect that I think is interesting is a lot of you wanted to refer to the functionality of a table, and so what would define a table is what it's used for. So a table is defined in terms of its function, and that's interesting, I think, for lots of reasons. But one aspect I want to point out here of this idea of functionality is talking about a lot of you referred to as what tables are commonly used for or mostly used for, and so there was this idea of most commonly used for and so on. So one of my questions is, does this really even matter for a table, right? So do we define a table clearly? Let me start over and say this. If we define a table in terms of its structure, legs, flat surface, able to support things, then clearly we must add and call things tables that, like I said earlier, nobody would really call a table, things like a podium, things like bookshelves and so on. They fit the definition, but they're not tables, and we all recognize that. So clearly just the physical structure isn't going to count, isn't going to get us where we want. But if we refer to the functionality, what's used as a table, then we say, okay, well, what do you do at tables? What function do tables serve? They support things, whether I'm, resting stuff and so on. My mouse, this camera, they support bookshelves you can't see and so on. But there are places we sit at also to do things. We don't just put stuff on, but we sit at to eat. Of course, we put food on, but it's also a place we go to do things. We can sit at tables and have discussions, for example, without any food or without placing anything on it, without even putting your hands and arms on it. A table is a place where we go to, and not just a metaphorical place, but a table serves a function, that it's a place for people to sit at and so on. Maybe so. But then we ask, does it really matter what that function is? What if I created a table what if I created a table without any purpose? Or let's say the purpose of the table I created was simply to illustrate what tables looked like. So let's say maybe I'm interested in history and the history of tables, and I want to show what a 13th century table looked like. Probably not much different, obviously, but let's say there was a difference. So I made a table, not to put things on, not to sit at, not to, whatever, just to be displayed as an example of what a 13th century table looked like. So here I've created an object, the intent of which is something like art. Now, can you sit at the table? Yes. Can you eat at it? Yes. Can you? Yes, you can do all of these things. But that's not what it's for. It's so someone can see what a table is. Is it still a table? So according to this functionality business, there's a sense in which no, it's not. But clearly we see the table, and clearly it's a table. Anyone in their right mind would call it a table. Right? So, and there's other problems with functionality, this talk of function. So if you're not, for example, another problem is that, so if you're not using a table, right, if the table's in the dumpster in the landfill, is it still a table? Well, it's not being used as a table. Also, if I take my chair and use it as a table, is it actually a table? And there's, I think, a point where most of us would want to say, no, in fact, it's not. You might be using it as a table, but it's not a table. And so on. So there's some problems even with talking about the functionality of the thing. Other responses would be at this point to say things like, well, it's just a matter of perspective. And I want to call to question a few things here to sort of stop that line of reasoning. Not just here, but hopefully when you go on and in life and you do these things, that you don't rely on, or you recognize the idea of saying it's just a perspective. You recognize that as not being any kind of real legitimate answer. So some people will say, well, it's just a matter of perspective. If you perceive it as being a table, then it's a table, and so on. And part of the reason this answer arises is because of the difficulty, the sheer difficulty of actually trying to nail down what a table is. What makes a table such that we all recognize it, given all the differences in functionality and structure and materials and so on? What makes a table such that we all recognize it? So one of the problems of saying it's just a matter of perspective is, well, if it's just a matter of perspective and we're being a realist about that, that means it really is a matter of perspective. And so if you perceive something as a table, then it really is a table. Then you could perceive anything as a table, right? The mouse pad, what if you perceived it as a table? Now remember, you can't rely on the definition now because you're saying it's the perception that makes it a table, right? And so if it's just your perception, then you could perceive this as a table, and if you're a realist about this, then it actually is a table. So your perception makes it a table. Or let's say you really believed it was a table, then it would really be a table. You could see the awkwardness of this. So whatever you perceived as being a table would in fact be a table. But of course, you don't really believe that it's just a matter of perception. If someone said they sincerely believed this was a table, you would think that they would be mistaken. And when you and I, and everyone else point to a table, we don't really think that it's a table just because we all perceive the same thing. Or if you do, then you run into the problem of how do we know that we're all perceiving the same thing? I'm not trying to be tricky here, but right? If perception makes something real, right, then if we all point to the table, let's say this, right, and say it's a table, then presumably we're all perceiving the same thing. But how would you know that someone's perceiving it? Maybe they're seeing some other object or whatever, and they're just calling it a table, and it's not what we perceive as being a table. Right? So how could you even know that? How could you even know what everyone else is perceiving? So that sort of becomes a problem. We can call it the problem of perception, right? Second of all, the second problem would be, what are we perceiving? Are we perceiving the same thing? And so on. Meaning that if we're all, let's say we all are perceiving the same thing, then presumably there's something there that we're all perceiving, and we're perceiving in the same way. And the question comes back again, what is that thing that we're perceiving? How do we recognize it? Is it its structure? Is it its function? And so on. So this business about it just being your perception is not an answer. And if it is a matter of perception, then it deserves some sort of argument, some sort of defense. How is it just my perception? How is it that just perceiving something makes it real? So it's not an answer to say, well, it's just a matter of perception. So things get complicated, right? things get messy when we can't define the term and so on. So you say, well, there's no answer, or it's just a matter of perspective. This is never going to be any sort of answer. We're talking about tables here, but we could imagine more complicated things like love and justice and the nature of God, maybe, or what the singularity was and so on. Saying it's just a matter of perspective is never going to be an answer, and so it's not ever going to be taken as an answer. So maybe there's a way by the end of this video here in a few minutes that we can begin to sort of answer this question. So be careful of that type of fallacy, saying it's just a matter of perspective. You don't really believe that in the first place, but think of the consequences if it were actually true. It's probably not something you're willing to accept. So what would be an answer? Well, one answer might be to say something like, well, maybe tables aren't real in the sense that we think they are. Maybe when we use the word table, what we mean is that it's some general, let's call it a fuzzy concept that isn't rigidly defined, that encompasses lots and lots of different things, and in the end, there is no thing that defines a table. It's just a very easy catch-all term that helps us navigate the world. So in that sense, tables as some rigidly defined thing don't exist. They're just a way of, it's just a word we use that helps us navigate. So as it turns out, tables might not be sort of real things. It might just be a fuzzy concept. And it works. As some of you saw with your definitions, and if this was a regular class, you would see this even more clearly. There is no getting at what all tables have in common. It actually seems as if we can't define what tables are. It doesn't mean we should stop using the word. It doesn't mean that when we're talking about a table, that we can't legitimately talk about this thing. And let's say, let's meet at the table. Let's say we say, let's meet at the table. That's still meaningful. It's just that there's no actual thing, or let's say some specific unified concept that picks out the realness of a table. It's just a vague concept that we use to navigate the world. And this is why you're having such a hard time defining what tables are. Because there might be a sense in which they're not actually real. Not in the hard sense that we want it to be real. Which tells us something. And this is the point of the whole exercise. It matters how we define things. I mean, it does. You don't just get to define however you want. You should recognize that from this exercise. But our definitions do matter. And we should try to be a little careful how we define things. And it's not just a matter of perspective. And even though we might get things wrong, or we might not be clear about what we're talking about and so on, doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Right? So we can begin to be a little clear in the everyday world about what we mean by tables. It's the type of thing that we tend to sit at, that we tend to eat at, that we tend to do things at. Yes, it includes lots of things that we wouldn't normally call a table. That's fine. The point is, we can't always look to the dictionary to tell us what a table is. We have to go beyond those sorts of things. We have to look into the quote-unquote essence of a table, or the nature of tableness, and so on. And we have to go beyond these normal, everyday conceptions of what we mean by things. And that's just a table. Imagine deeper concepts like love, like justice, like goodness, like fairness, and so on, and so on, and so on. Certainly, I think you can see at this point that it has nothing to do with just your perspective. Is your perspective correct? Would be a better way of going about this, right? If you want to bring perspective into it. So again, one of the points here is that trying to be clear about what we mean is very difficult. But when things get tough, saying it's your perspective or something like that, or maybe there's just no answer, doesn't cut it. We need to press on and look for an answer that we can deal with. And one answer to this is to say, well, tables aren't real. Not in the sense that we want them to be, but we can go ahead and formulate some sort of concept that we can use, because we need to talk about tables. We need to talk about tables. But we can recognize that maybe tables just don't admit of that strict type of definition we want. And that's fine, so we can still talk about tables, but in the end, we might have to admit, but tables actually aren't real in the hard sense that we want. So I want you to think about that possibility and think about what that means for some of the other things that we talk about that are important. All right, that concludes this part of the video. There'll be more of these to come, I think. And all right, have a nice one. Bye.